2 Kings chapter 13 is where we are right now, looking at this overall thought of God's compassion for rebellious Israel. And so we started this last week, and we were able to cover the first section of the chapter in verses 1 through 9, looking at Jehoahaz's reign. And so we went through and looked in those 9 verses and noticed how we see the mercy and the compassion of God and all of that. Of course, when you look at Jehoahaz, we find that Jehoahaz was not a good king, but instead he's characterized by the evil and the wickedness that he did. But nonetheless, when it was that they were being plagued by the Syrians, and Jehoahaz realized that he couldn't do anything himself, that he wasn't going to be able to withstand the attacks of the Syrians and keep them back, well, what happened is he decided that it was time to turn to God, and it was. He pleaded with the Lord heard him because the Lord had compassion on his people for what it was going on, the oppression that they were facing. And so the Lord delivered them from the Syrians. We talked about some of the possibilities of who that deliverer or that savior, depending on your translation, might have been. And then everything seems good, but what did the people immediately do once they had some sense of normalcy again? They went right back to evil. And of course, there's a lot of application that's made from that particular thought that we don't need to do as they did, but we need to make sure that when we see the mercy and compassion of God in our lives, when He delivers and saves us, that we need to continue in faithful obedience to Him. They continued in their idolatry and in their wickedness, and as a result, even though they were delivered from the Syrians, they are left in a very, 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 emphasis on very, weakened state. You look again at the end of, or towards the end of that section in verse 7, and we find that He, that is God, left the army of Jehoahaz only 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, 10,000 foot soldiers, for the king of Syria had destroyed them and made them like the dust at threshing. In other words, even though the people of Israel were able to overcome and defeat the Syrians by the power of God, well, they were left completely devastated and just completely run over. That's not enough people to support and to defend an entire nation, but that's the state they were left in because of their continued wickedness and continued idolatry. Then you had those final 2 verses, verses 8 and 9 of that section, that just kind of gives that wrapping it up statement that we see so often with these kings, where it is that there was more that was done in their history records that we don't have, but we know all that we need to know of Jehoahaz, and then we find that he dies. He's buried with his fathers, and then his son Joash reigns in his place. And that's where we're picking up now, where we'll look at this reign of Joash. You might notice, of course, right there in verse 9, it specifically says Joash, but then you get down into verse 10, and you're going to start seeing him referred to as Jehoash. That's just some of these names that we find here in the Old Testament where you had kind of more than one name, and sometimes the second name can kind of differentiate because you also had not just a Joash in Israel, but also a Joash in Judah, so it gets confusing. But we're talking right now about Joash in Israel. So as we get into this, let's start with verses 10 to 13, where we'll see this summary of Joash's reign. If somebody could, would you read 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 10 to 13.
In the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, became king over Israel and Samaria, and reigned 16 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, but walked in them. Now the rest of the acts of Joash, all that he did, and his might with which he fought against Amaziah, king of Judah, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Joash rested with his fathers. Then Jeroboam sat on his throne, and Joash was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel.
Thank you, Ben. You got a lot of fun names in that. You did good. Thank you. So we find here a summary of Joash's reign, and of course the confusion begins in verse 10 because who was king in Judah at this time? Joash is king in Judah, but also who's king now in Israel? Joash. right? So you have Joash and Joash. That's why you have some of that differentiation of Jehoash here in Israel. But that's what's going on. It's in the 37th year of Joash of Judah's reign. And if you go back and look, we find that he reigned for 40 years. We see that at the start of 2 Kings chapter 12. So we're near the end of that 40-year reign when it is that Joash of Israel begins to reign in Israel. And at this time, he's 16 years old. I find it interesting when we go back and look, and you just see some of the different ages at which some of these sons were placed into that position. A lot of times what we find really is that it was the advisors and the counselors who were calling the shots, and it's just some of these people who were sort of the face of it until they can get older and they're able to make more decisions and things of that nature. But Joash, 16 years old when he becomes king. And we find that really nothing was different between his reign and his father's reign. Because how is it that Joash's reign is characterized based on verse 11? All right, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He continued in the sins of Jeroboam. Same exact thing that his father did. Look back up at 2 Kings 13 and verse 2. It tells us concerning Joash's father, Jehoahaz, that he did evil in the sight of the Lord and followed the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, and he did not depart from them. You find, the same exact thing, more or less, that's said now in verse 11 concerning Joash. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, but walked in them, like father, like son. And far too often we find that family follows in our footsteps. This can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. How is it that understanding and seeing this example here of like father, like son, how might that be a frightening thing?
Well, the young are going to imitate what they see in the old.
Yeah. So the young, our kids, our grandkids, they're going to imitate what they see in us. They're going to follow what it is that we're doing. How might that be scary? Do what?
You're always under the eye.
You're always under the eye, right? And if we're not doing as we should be doing, 9 times out of 10, what does that mean our children or grandchildren are going to start doing? The same thing, and they'll be doing what they should not be doing. Right? It's a humbling thing to stop and think about, well, my kids, my grandkids are watching me. It's a scary thing if we're not doing as we should be doing. If we're not living as we should be doing. But does it have to be a scary thing? So how might it be then, instead of being frightening, how might that be exciting? When we're doing right. But now what's that require from us to make sure we're doing right? We've got to put forth effort. We've got to show some humility. We've got to make sure that we're trying our best to know God's Word so that we can live right with Him, so that then our kids can see us doing our best to be obedient to God. So that our kids see us when it is that we slip up, when we mess up, that we don't try to ignore it, that we don't try to cover it off, that we don't pass the blame off to someone else, but they see us with humility, taking ownership, and doing what needs to be done to make it right, as difficult and as challenging as that might be. Because like Aaron pointed out, kids are going to do what they see us doing. And if they see us just ignoring those things and acting like, it's not that big deal, it's not as bad as this over here, could have been that, and we just brush it off, kids are going to do the same thing. And it's just going to follow in that continuous cycle. Geraldine, did I see your hand?
Yes, sir. I was just going to say it can be exciting because then you can conquer things like self-control and slowing your tongue and thinking about what you're saying, because you have to whenever kids are around, because you got to, not even just something like saying stupid or anything like that. That's just not something you want your toddler to repeat after you. So you just have to really kind of slow your speech in your brain and really think about that. And that's exciting to conquer things that you feel like you're struggling with. So it's a great motivator to just do it, because you don't want to hear them saying that or doing whatever.
Yeah. So not just exciting in the sense that, not exciting in the long-term sense of thinking, okay, our kids are going to follow in that. That is exciting. But exciting in maybe a more immediate sense, like you're saying, to recognize the growth that we can see even in ourselves in that. And that is exciting to be able to stop and think about how far we've come. Used to be this, I maybe would have used to react in this way, But now I've been able to grow to this point, and that is an exciting thing for sure. And so absolutely, it can be frightening, but it doesn't have to be. That if we're doing as we should be doing, living as we should be living, growing as we should be growing, then our kids will be able to follow in that. And that's an encouraging and exciting thing. And so we need to do our best to live as we should, grow as we should, be the people of God that we should be, and hope and trust and pray that our children do the same. Because we find the history throughout the Old Testament so often that the children follow in the footsteps of the parents and the grandparents. And I understand it doesn't always follow in that way, but the formula for success is going to be much, much, much higher whenever it is that we're doing as we should be doing and giving that good example to our children. So we see, at least for Joash, however, he wasn't doing as he should have been doing. His father wasn't doing as he should have been doing, and they were just continuing the cycle of wicked. They were following in the sins of Jeroboam. Now we look at verse 12 out of 2 Kings 13 that Benjamin read for us a moment ago. And you get to verse 12 and you see kind of that statement about the rest and all else that he did. We don't really know that much about Joash just based on these verses right here. But we know that there was more he did, that all he did and his might with which he fought against Amaziah, king of Judah. It says, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So another mention to that historical record they had, they could go back and see. We will read a little bit more about him in chapter 14, especially as it relates to his might against Amaziah. That's going to be one of the key parts in chapter 14. But at this point, all we need to know and understand about Joash is the fact that he was wicked, that he followed in the sins of Jeroboam, meaning that he's continuing on in that path of idolatry. Then verse 13, we find that Joash rested with his fathers, and Jeroboam sat on his throne. So this would be Jeroboam the second, Joash's son, and Joash then is buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel. So we would think this is the only record we have here of Joash, but we're going to find a little bit more about him, because there's a very important event that happens in Israel in the midst of Joash's reign, but it doesn't necessarily focus on Joash himself, although he's part of it. And that's what we're going to look at now as the chapter continues. Verses 14 to 19, we find Joash and God's prophet. If somebody could, go ahead and read 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 14 through 19.
Elisha had become sick with the illness of which he would die. And then Joash, the king of Israel, came down to him and wept over his face and said, "Oh, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen." And Elisha said to him, "Take a bow and some arrows." So he took himself a bow and some arrows. Then he said to the king of Israel, "Put your hand on the bow." So he put his hand on it, and Elisha put his hand on the king's hand. And he said, "Open the east window," and he opened it. Then Elisha said, "Shoot," and he shot. And he said, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance, and the arrow of the deliverance from Syria, for you must strike the Syrians at Aphek, and till you have destroyed them." Then he said, "Take the arrows." So he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, "Strike the ground." So he struck it 3 times and stopped. Keep going.
Go ahead and do verse 19.
And the man of God was angry with him and said, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times, and then you would have struck Syria till you had destroyed it. But now you will strike Syria only 3 times."
So we find in these verses where Joash is going to see Elisha, as Elisha is nearing the end of his life. Verse 14, he's going to pay his respects. And, you give Joash credit, at least where credit is due. Yes, he is a wicked and an evil king, but he's still going and showing his respect to Elisha, the man of God. He should have been doing this more and should have been doing this continually throughout his reign, but at least he is now. Unfortunately, it's not going to really make a big difference on Joash or on the nation, but it will as time goes on, or at least it should have. And so we see within this, in verse 14 there's a specific thing that's said as Joash goes and he comes before him and weeps over Elisha as he's there. dealing with this illness. What is it that Joash says?
Oh, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen.
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, he's talking about Elijah.
There you go. You go back to 2 Kings chapter 2. That's the same exact thing that Elisha said concerning Elijah when Elijah was taken up into heaven there in the chariot. And so within this, I talked a little bit about it back in chapter 2 about some of what that particular title, name, phrase, whatever it is you want to call it, a little bit about some of the significance behind it. But I can't help but think in this particular moment, what do you think might have been going through Elisha's mind when he hears that?
Maybe I get carried up too.
He's maybe now thinking back to his mentor Elijah, what Elijah received, and he's maybe going to be able to find some comfort in that. That he's going to be able soon to go to be with his mentor, more importantly to be with his God. And so we find that particular phrase, and I just find that interesting to make that connection back to chapter 2 where it is that Elisha himself said that concerning Elijah. But now there's some specific instruction that needs to be done. And what is it that Elisha is telling Joash to do?
Take some bows and arrows.
Yeah, get you a bow and arrow, go open the window, and start shooting them arrows out. I really wanted to have like one of those little toy bow and arrows at this point that I could pull it out and just start shooting it out. I guess that's when you have a girl and you don't have a boy. We just don't have toy bow and arrows lying around. We got a lot of dress-up dresses lying around. That's all right, though. Also, Jared told me, he said, if you do that, you know you're going to end up hitting someone in the head. So I guess it's probably wise I don't. But nonetheless, Elisha tells Joash, go open up the east window, start shooting the arrows toward Aphek. And that arrow would be symbolic of the arrow of the Lord's deliverance and the arrow of his deliverance from Syria. Pull this map up. We don't know exactly where Elisha would have been at this point, but one of the last times that we specifically saw someone going to Elisha was up at Mount Carmel. And so here on the map, you've got Samaria, capital down here. Carmel would have been up in this general area here. And of course, Aphek is over to the east. So it only makes sense. If you're going to shoot the arrow toward Aphek, then you're going to open the east window, shoot it out that way. And I guess I'm pointing that way. Really, here, east is that way. See, I don't know if y'all realize how confusing like north, south, east, west is to people in my generation. Because we always just pull it up on our phone and we have the arrow just to point the direction we are and tell me to turn right, tell me to turn left. That's a rant for another day and another time. But yes, that is the east over there. And so we see how Joash is receiving this instruction. So he goes, he opens the arrow, and he starts shooting, and he interprets Elisha's instruction to mean, how many arrows do I shoot? How many arrows did Joash end up shooting? 3. He shoots 3 arrows. Now Elisha didn't tell him specifically how many to shoot. This is just in Joash's mind. All right, Elisha, I guess I'll go and shoot 1, shoot 2, shoot 3. I don't know if I can shoot an arrow any further than that, so we'll call that one good. And then he's done. But what's Elisha's response? You should have shot more. It tells us that Elisha was angry with him, that he's not happy. Because what should he have done? Should have shot 5, should have shot 6 times, and then what would have happened? You'd be able to have destroyed Syria, but you stopped short. Candy?
Is that something he should have known? Is there some significance in this? It just seems so random, and like he's like, oh, I'm going to do it 3 times. Oh, that was stupid. You should have done it 5 times. What? That
yeah.
just seems so random. So should he have known, or is that just random like it is to us?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the best I've got for you on that. But I think maybe, I hope maybe from that we can pull a little bit of a lesson though, because in his mind, obviously he thought 3 times was sufficient. He could have just shot it once and called it good.
That's what I'm saying. I think he might thought, well, I'm going to show him I'll do it 3. And he's
Yeah.
so excited.
Yeah. And obviously the 3 times wasn't enough, so hopefully here in just a minute we'll pull some application from that. Ben?
I was gonna say in verse 25, at the end there, it says 3 times Joash defeated him
Mm-hmm.
and recaptured the city.
Right.
That had some significance maybe back and
Yes.
forth.
Yes, yeah, if you didn't hear Ben going ahead to verse 25, that you see how Joash would actually attack the Syrians 3 times. So there is the connection between the number of arrows he shoots, how many times he attacks them. And of course, to Elisha's point, if you'd done it 5 times, if you'd done it 6 times, you'd have been able to just completely destroy them and get rid of the problem. But he was able to do a little bit, but not quite enough. Did I see your hand, Kate?
Yeah, I was just wondering if it wasn't, and I'm sure everybody else is thinking this, just symbolic of, maybe he had 6 in his book, and it's like, why didn't you use all that you have? Use everything that God gives you, everything that we have, that's what we need to give. We don't need to stop short, be like, okay, well, I think that's enough, that's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
But everything that you surprise us with is what we need to use.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, if you didn't hear Kay recognizing that maybe it's the case that he had the 5, the 6 arrows in his quiver, and he just decided to stop after 3, thinking that was good enough. But the point that Kay's pulling from that is realizing we need to use everything that God gives us and not be stopping short in that. And that's kind of that application that I think that we can draw in it is when we think of what we're learning from the missed opportunity here, and y'all have been pulling it out, is that we don't need to stop short. That sometimes we think, well, this is good enough. And Kay, to your point, thinking about the arrows in the quiver and the skills that God has given us, that maybe we think, well, I've applied myself in this way, I've applied myself in this way, and maybe I'm not quite as good in that area over there, but I still know I have some ability in it, and we just kind of decide to set that aside and not really give our all in it, to not really apply ourselves to the best of our ability in every way that we can. And so what happens is sometimes, unfortunately, we end up stopping short. And we think that 3 times, we think 3 arrows is good enough when we need to keep going. We need to work in this other area. We need to apply ourselves over here. And 3 arrows, that was pretty good, right? 3 victories against the Syrians, as Ben pointed out when you get down towards the end of the chapter. That's good, but it's not as good as it could have been. And so that's a good point to recognize. Apply ourselves, use the skills that God has given us to the best of our ability, and do not stop short in those things. Even when we think it's good enough, we need to keep on going. Then in verses 20 and 21, we find where the man of God dies. We find Elisha's death. Somebody read these 2 verses for us, if you would.
Then Elijah died, and they buried him. And the raiding band from Moab invaded the land in the spring of the year. So it was, as they were burying a man, that suddenly they spied a band of raiders, and they put the man in the tomb of Elijah. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elijah, he received and stood on his feet.
Verse 20, the first part of that, we see where Elisha dies, and so they bury him. And then as soon as it seems like Elisha has been buried, that the stone's been sealed up over the tomb, the situation there, he's died, he's buried, and what starts happening? The Moabites start coming back. The Moabite raiders begin to come back into the land that particular spring. Does anybody remember the last time that we read anything about the Moabites causing problems for the people of Israel? You got to go all the way back to 2 Kings chapter 3. 2 Kings chapter 3 was the last time that we saw problems with the Moabites and the people of Israel. And the Israelites had opportunity in 2 Kings chapter 3 to completely do away with the Moabites, to get rid of the problem altogether. There was very specific instruction that they were told to do in those battles and in all of the cities of the Moabites. And they did pretty good. They shot 4 arrows, if you will, but they didn't go to the extent of that 5th or that 6th. And if you look at 2 Kings chapter 3 and verse 25, there's that little phrase in that verse that tells us that the stones of Kir Hareseth were intact. One of the specific instruction is that you get rid of all of it, that you tear down all the walls, you get rid of the stones. Because if you leave even just a little bit left behind in the Moabite cities, it's going to be that much easier for them to rebuild, to start regaining their strength, waiting for their opportunity that they have now found with the man of God no longer among the people of Israel. They didn't do what they should have done back then, and now we have problems. That's a lesson that we can learn in this. If we don't do everything that we should do as God tells us to do it, we may not necessarily see the problem in our lifetime. It may not even be in our children's lifetime, but it might come down the road to our grandchildren or to our great-grandchildren. And it goes right in line, I believe, too, even with that thought of Joash, that he should have shot 4, should have shot 5, should have shot 6 arrows, but he stopped short. I'm sure back in 2 Kings 3 in those battles that the Israelite army thought, hey, this is probably good enough, right? We've destroyed the walls and the stones of all of these other cities, so why does it matter if we leave the stones of Kir Hareseth intact? This is why. Kason?
And just going along with what you were saying, it definitely feels like the reprimand about the arrows and the Moabites coming back after they weren't destroyed like God said to, are lessons for him and saying you need to destroy all these Syrians. And he obviously still doesn't do it because he attacks them 3 times. But it just feels like, just the way that it sets up the verses there, that those are both God telling him, hey, this is what you need to do, because I'm telling you right now, only doing it 3 times isn't going to be enough. And I'm showing you that when it didn't happen last time like I said it should, they're going to come back and cause problems later on. And that's exactly, he still does, obviously we already looked at it, he still doesn't follow through with it, but that's just God telling us time and time again, you know, what we need to do.
Right, yeah, it definitely ties in, and whenever we really get, even into verse 21 here in just a second, we'll see as well that it's God also being able to say, you need to turn to me, you need to trust in me, because when you're doing it your own way, these are the types of things that begin to happen. And so that's a good thought to recognize there, Kason. Paul?
Think about when God says is good, what he calls evil is evil. And when he tells us to put evil away, it doesn't mean 99% away. It means 100%. Get away from it. Because 1% will ruin you. You're always like, I can manage it, I can handle it. You know, I've got 99%. I've done what you said other than 1%. And I'll manage that, and I'll do better, and 1% will ruin you.
Yeah.
And when God tells us, like the destruction of the Moabites, not part of them, all of them, there's a reason. But 100% of what he calls evil away, and then then you have the control, the power that God has instilled in you to live the life you're supposed to live. Not partial, 100%.
Yeah. Well, it's like thinking if you have a bottle of water, and it's good, it's clean, it's pure for 99% of it, but you take 1% out of the cow pasture out there where there's a little puddle that's been sitting and you don't know what bacteria has been growing there, and it's just been sitting. And even though that's only 1% of what you put in that bottle of water, how many of us want to drink that bottle of water now? Because that 1% affects the other 99% in there. And Aaron may want to drink it, but
it depends on how
we'll,
thirsty you are, but not
we'll-
on a regular basis, no.
we'll maybe come visit you in the hospital.
Yeah,
right?
do.
Aaron, you have a wife now. You can't be taking those risks, okay? Christy needs you healthy, right? And so but we recognize, to Paul's point, that if we're going to do it right, we've got to do it completely right. That if we're going to get rid of the evil, we can't leave just that 1% behind and think, well, I did 99%, I got rid of 99%, so I can hold on to this one piece of sin in my life. It doesn't work that way. Even that 1% affects the entirety that remains. And that's kind of what we have going on here, is we're recognizing in these things. But another lesson that we're going to find, and it's specifically going to come out of verse 21. Verse 21 has always been one of the most interesting verses in the Bible to me, because it just seems, I don't know, I don't want to say that it seems out of place, but it's just like such a difference from what everything else that we've been looking at is right now. And it's just this one little verse that seems kind of like an aside of another story at some point. We don't know exactly when in the grand scheme of things that this particular event takes place. But as it relates to the Moabites coming back into the land, that's our connection to this right here. The Moabites have been coming into the land. It started after it is that Elisha died and was buried. And it tells us in verse 21, as it was, they were burying a man, and suddenly they spied a band of raiders. So they put the man in the tomb of Elisha, and when the man was let down, and that's kind of a very soft translation the New King James has of let down. Actually, if you go back and look at that, it literally means like they threw him in. So they're seeing the Moabites coming in, and they realize we've got to get out of here quick. And so they don't do a nice, formal burial. They literally throw this man in. And what happens? He touches the bones of Elisha and he says, hey, y'all wait up for me. Don't you know that was quite the scene? The Moabite raiders who were coming that way, they don't know anything that's going on. But if you're some of the ones who were there in that burial party, and in their tradition, it's not like this man was in a coma and he just kind of came to. No, this man was dead. And they threw him in that tomb. He comes in contact with the bones of Elisha. And next thing you know, this man is revived and he's good as new. And then what do you think the impact on the people in the city might have been when he comes walking back with everybody? And they're saying, weren't you just wrapped up in burial cloth? And weren't they taking you out there to bury you? Don't you think this is going to have an impact on the people? You think this should have an impact on us? So what do you think the lesson here might be?
Come in contact with the blood of Christ, and you too shall be raised.
All right. So you see that New Testament application, when you come in contact with the blood of Christ, that we shall be raised as well. So we have a good spiritual New Testament application there. What else might we find?
Don't get buried alive.
All right. Yeah, there's you a lesson. Don't get buried alive. Thankfully, our medical society and all that today, we don't worry about that quite as much. Back in the day, that was a problem. They'd tie the little string around your finger and they'd have the bell and you'd start ringing it. Yeah, that used to be something. What was that? Don't underestimate the power of God. And that's the big lesson in this. What's the problem the Israelites are facing right now? Idolatry, problems with the Syrians, problems now with the Moabites. Who was really the last person in Israel that we've seen that was able to help them out when these situations popped up? Elisha. But they don't have him anymore, do they? But even though they don't have Elisha, who do they still have? God. It's a reminder, you turn to God. Don't underestimate his power. How is it that you were able to handle the problem of the Moabites before? You turned to Elisha, and who did Elisha turn to? He turned to God. How is it that you're going to be able to handle the problem of the Syrians? You better turn to God. How are you going to handle the problems of any other nation that comes and poses a threat? You turn to God. How are you going to handle any problem that arises internally within the nation? You better turn to God. How do we handle the problems in our lives? We better be turning to God. Not underestimating his power, and that is the big lesson to pull from this. For the longest time, I'd always look at that and I'm like, that's just a really interesting story and that's pretty amazing, but what's it matter? We don't need to stop short in it, but we need to make sure that we actually work to try to get to the point, to understand why it mattered to them, why it matters to us. And we see that good and that clear application from it. I found a quote on this as it relates to this very point, that it shows that even though the prophet was dead, Jehovah was still the living God and the God of power. His promises would not fail, and his people needed to come to life again. And so that even gets Aaron to your spiritual point in this, that we need to make sure we come to life. And that if it is perhaps that maybe we already have obeyed the gospel, but we start to just kind of taper off and we get a little bit stagnant and we've spiritually died again, what needs to happen? We need to be revived. Come back to him, turn back to him, and come to life again. And so that's part of the lesson that we learn in this. Andy?
I also think about the legacy that we leave behind.
Mm-hmm.
We see continually the evil legacy of Jeroboam constantly brought up. and at evil as their father, their grandfather, great-great-grandfather. But we see now Elisha, dead and gone. It was the power of God working through his bones.
Yeah.
But you kind of see that semblance of leaving that legacy behind, of doing good, trying to restore the nation.
Yeah, that's a really good point to draw out of this. If you didn't hear Andy thinking about the legacy that's there, that when you look at Joash, or even before that to Jehoahaz, following in the steps of Jeroboam, the Jeroboam's legacy of evil continued, but now here's Elisha. Elisha has died. We don't know how long things had been since he'd been buried there in that tomb, but nonetheless, even though Elisha was not physically there with them, his legacy carried on, reviving that man, and you would hope that it would spur a revival then within the nation of them turning back to God. And certainly, if we're living as we ought to, going back to one of our earlier points of application, that's going to be an exciting thing, because then our legacy can carry on, and our children and our grandchildren. And so even though at some point we're not going to be here on this earth anymore, our legacy of good can continue. But if we're not careful, it might end up being a legacy of evil. And so we've got to make sure that we're living as we should, striving to be the people of God that we should be. And if we find ourselves in need of that revival, well, we find the point right here of where it is we turn. We turn to God. You get to the New Testament, to Aaron's point, we go to the blood of Christ Jesus, and we do what needs to be done to live for him. So that gives us Joash's reign there in those verses. And again, we'll see a little bit more of what was done when we get into chapter 14. But let's see if we can't finish up chapter 13 now, verses 22 to 25, where we will see the kings of Syria. Somebody read, if you would, verses 22 and 23.
And Hazael, the king of Syria, oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz. But the Lord was gracious to them, had compassion on them, and regarded them, because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not yet destroy them or cast them from his presence.
All right, so Hazael's causing problems. Same thing we saw back at the top of the chapter. This is just starting to wrap things up for us in this particular narrative here. The king of Syria is oppressing Israel all the days of Jehoahaz. And then verse 23, what do we see from the Lord? We see his being gracious. We see his grace. We see his mercy. We see his compassion, even though, how were the people of Israel living? Horribly. They weren't even looking to him. They're looking to idols of wood and stone and silver and gold. But God was compassionate. God was gracious. God was merciful toward them. He regarded them because of what?
His ultimate plan and covenant.
Because of his covenant.
His promise.
His promise. God regarded them because God is faithful. Even if we are faithless, we read in the New Testament, he remains what? Faithful. God is a good, a loving, a compassionate, a faithful, and a merciful God. And he would not yet destroy them or cast them from his presence, because back to Velda, Aaron's point, God's ultimate plan is still at play here. It shows us again still just how patient God is. If this was us in the situation, if we were in God's shoes, and if the children of Israel were doing all of these things and acting the way that they were toward us, what would we be doing? Y'all are done. I'm sick and tired of this. Y'all are stiff-necked, right? Y'all are stubborn. All of these things that we'd be going through. But how does God respond to it? Patience, mercy, grace. But nonetheless, we still see his justice in these things. That they're still receiving the things that they are due. They're still dealing with the punishment of their ways, but God continues to give them opportunity to come back to him because of his grace, his mercy, his compassion, his love, and because of his faithfulness. And then we'll see verses 24 and 25, Ben-Hadad and Israel's victories. Someone read these two verses.
Now Hazael, king of Syria, died. Then Ben-Hadad, his son, reigned in his place. And Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, recaptured from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which he had taken out of the hand of Jehoahaz his father by war. 3 times Joash defeated him and recaptured the cities of Israel.
So Benjamin kind of got us here earlier with the 3 arrows that Joash shot. This gives him the 3 victories and over some of the cities, 3 victories over the Syrians, and being able to reclaim part of the land that had been taken. This is a map that we looked at in a previous chapter of land that was taken. Hazael had already taken basically everything on the east side of the Jordan, and then now some had started to be taken on the west, and Joash is starting to reclaim some of this land. Now, one of the things also we talked about earlier in chapter 13 as it related to the deliverance that came from the Syrians, Joash was king at this point, but Joash also, we find just based on history and archaeology, was aligning himself with kings of other nations. So this is that Stela of Adad-Nirari that we put up when we first got into chapter 13. Adad-Nirari III would have been a king of not Syria, but Assyria. That gets confusing at times as well, but this is a king of Assyria. And what we find from this particular historical archaeological record is that Joash actually would pay tribute to this king. And so we know that this king was helping them then to be able to come in and attack the Syrians on the other side, weakening out their army and their defenses, making it easier then for Joash on his side of the battle. And so that's something that we find that was going on. And I did see your hand, but I need to get through these 3 points before that second bell. So 3 takeaways we have from this chapter. God is a gracious, merciful, faithful God of deliverance. We see it early on in the chapter, and we've just circled back to it again right here at the end. God is gracious, merciful, and a faithful God of deliverance. Second takeaway we have, don't stop short. That goes back to the arrows. That goes back to, as Kay pointed out, the skills and the abilities that God has given us. Don't stop short in that, but use what God has given us as best as we can. We love Him with all of our heart, our soul, our strength, and our mind. Every fiber of our being, use it for Him. Then lastly, find hope in God's ability to bring what is dead to life. And that goes right along with Aaron's spiritual application that he drew out of that with the man touching the bones of Elisha and then being revived. That when we find ourselves in that state, when we find our hope even perhaps being dead, turn to Him, look to Him, and let Him bring it back to life. So that's what we have of 2 Kings 13. And Lord willing, next week we will pick up in chapter 14.